and it hit hard. And the economy began shrinking. So jobs were being lost, the economy was getting worse, et cetera, et cetera. And it took a few years to recover from that. And you can see it took about a year or so for the economy to hit that bottom point before it started to come back up. And that's what's called a V-shaped recovery. And then you can see for a bunch of years, the economy was growing and doing well, and a number of really good things were happening. And then this point here on the right side of the graph is 6 weeks ago when COVID hit the United States particularly hard. And you can see the economy, the bottom literally fell out of the economy. It was devastating how dramatic the hit that the economy has taken was, and how quickly it has gone to a shrinking economy in just 6 short weeks. And Israel's going to talk about what this means for our unemployment claims.
Yeah, so what that means is, as we're seeing on the graph here, in the last 50 plus years, we have not seen unemployment claims go above 1 million. So if we look at the graph, it starts from 1967, and you would notice even during the Great Depression, around the 2008 period, if you look at that, not even, it doesn't pass 1 million. What we have seen from March 22nd to the 28th has been, and I know we use this word a lot, but it really has been unprecedented. We've never seen a situation like this before. Actually, a few days ago, the New York Times brought out a report, I think it was like 4 days ago, that said the figure now is 36 million people that have lost their jobs. 36 million people. If we could go to the next slide. And so what this means is that 12.7 million people have lost their health insurance. So with every job, a lot of jobs would enable, people get health insurance through their jobs. Some people would be able to pay for their health insurance or subsidize. It also means that a lot of folks are losing their health insurance. And ironic enough, during a public health crisis. We've also seen, we have a lot of folks in 509 that the Department of Transitional Assistance Workers, and they SNAP applications have gone way up. It's skyrocketed. We also have heard and we've seen on the news where children are being affected because schools are closed, and a lot of children, a lot of families depend on schools being open to be able to feed their kids. So this has been an astounding time, and as the slide also indicates, in the last 6 weeks, over 666,000 people lose jobs a day. So 666,000 jobs a day has been lost, and that is something to think about. That's actually more sobering than anyone could have predicted.
And we have some lessons that we've learned from the Great Recession of 2008. And now looking back on that, economists have actually gone back and have been able to show that inadequate public spending, so spending of taxpayer dollars on public service jobs, public services, funding for a number of things that the government pays for, those cuts actually made the recovery take longer. So it delayed the ability of the economy to recover after, because of those cuts. So what we are doing as Local 509, we are talking to every policymaker, to the governor, to the legislature, to the people in Washington, that if you cut spending on public services, and that includes public jobs, but also the services that are funded by that, you're actually going to hurt the economy more in the long run. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this means for the state budget and local budgets. Now in 2008, after the Great Recession, the states had to close the budget gap that was created. And most states, including Massachusetts, are constitutionally required to have a balanced budget. So they can't spend more than what they take in. The federal government does not have that requirement, which is why they're able to do what's called deficit spending. But most states don't have that. So how did the states make up for the budget shortfalls? And you can see here in this graph, 45% were from spending cuts to state budgets. And we're going to talk about what that translated into. And again, this is from 2008. 24% from federal emergency aid, 16% from raising taxes and fees, 9% from rainy day funds, and then some other measures. And the rainy day fund, comes up where Massachusetts does have a rainy day fund. It's about $3.5 billion. But the expected shortfall for Massachusetts is going to be about 6. So even if Massachusetts spent all of its rainy day fund, we would still have a $2.5 to $3 billion budget shortfall. And here is a map of what the states did in spending cuts during the Great Recession of 2008. And the white states that have no coloring in them on the map here didn't do any layoffs, no hiring freezes, no furloughs. The lighter green did one of those 3 things, either furloughing workers, laying off workers, or having hiring freeze. The kind of medium green color, those states did 2 of the 3, and the darker green did all 3. Now, Massachusetts on this shows a middle, the middle green color, which would be 2 of the 3 layoffs or hiring freezes. Massachusetts actually did all 3. Massachusetts had furloughs, Massachusetts laid off workers, and there were hiring freezes across that. So Massachusetts had all that, and the deepest cuts we saw came in healthcare, K through 12 education, higher education, services to the elderly and disabled, and public sector workforce. Now, these are all our members. Whether you work for the state, whether you work in childcare, whether you work in higher ed, whether you work in a private sector agency, our membership was hit the hardest in 2008 about this. And then here is a chart that shows the total number of state employees, public employees rather, across the entire country at right before the Great Recession. And then you see the dip here. About 700,000 public sector jobs were lost during the Great Recession. Now keep that number in mind, 700,000 public sector jobs were lost in the Great Recession that happened over a course of 5 years or so. Those job losses came in. And it wasn't until last year that we returned to the workforce, the same number of people who are public employees in the country before the pandemic hit. And here is what is really scary to me. Yeah. And this is starting to put what COVID-19 really means. During the recession of 2001, after 9/11, there were some hits to state budgets. Certainly Massachusetts was no exception. I worked for what was then the Department of Social Services. We had 218 social workers laid off just at that agency in 2002. During the Great Recession, the budget shortfalls were bigger than in 2001, significantly bigger, and lasted a little bit longer. But here we are with COVID-19, and the predicted shortfalls for 2020, for the current year, are predicted to be historic. Next year, the budget shortfalls are predicted to be 3 times as worse. 3 times worse. 39% of all state revenues are expected to be lost next fiscal year.
And so what that means is that we are going to enter a very painful time. Actually, Boston Globe said that tax revenue fell by 50% just in April as compared to this time 1 year ago. So, as was said before, $6 billion right now is a big shortfall and something we've never seen. And so what we have here, and by the way, that last slide, that was put out by the Congressional Budgetary Office, which is nonpartisan, and they take statistics from different places. So that in and of itself is something that is very troubling to see. And as we go to the next slide, you'll see so SEIU represents Local 509, which is your union, is part of SEIU, which is an international union that is based in DC. And so we have members that do the same work that you do all over the United States. And this is basically the breakdown of the change in jobs from February 2020 to April 2020. And what you've seen is what we've lost. We have lost, as you could see in state government, over 226,000 jobs. 802 local government, the healthcare 1.4, childcare 355,000 jobs, which we do represent family childcare as well. So what we have here is some analysis of what is happening, and we're seeing where these cuts are going to trickle down to.
And it's important to point out, Israel, these job losses happened over a 6-week period.
Over a 6-week period.
Remember the number I said before, public sector jobs lost during the Great Recession over a 5-year period was 600,000, 700,000. In 6 weeks, we have lost over 1 million public sector jobs.
And the reason, and we know that in Massachusetts, we expect that we will be seeing what a lot of other states have done. All right. So we know that California just a few days ago announced that they are cutting their stuff by 10%, their state budget by 10%. We know that that has happened also in New York. Our neighbors, Rhode Island, announced that they are going to make $800 million in cuts. And that is going to be seen quite a lot in not just in their public services, but also in services that are funded through public funds, which a lot of our private sector workers are funded through public sector funds. If we just go across to the next slide. So what does that mean? That means that the Congress, the House of Representatives got together last week, and they passed, you all may have heard about this, they passed something called the HEROES Act. And basically what was that was another stimulus bill representing $3 trillion that also had in it $500 billion earmarked towards helping state governments. But what happens, we know that that has passed in the House, so now it moves along to the Senate. When that moves to the Senate, now it is in the hands of, you'd see the picture of the person on the slide. His name is Mitch McConnell. He is the leader of the Senate. And so now it's up to him and his colleagues to present that on the Senate floor, to move the bill and for that to be passed. What has happened is that there's been some indication from Mitch McConnell where he's talked about, that bill is representing a blue state bailout, which is really something to be quite worried about, that things are being looked at as in a Republican or a Democratic sense when we have so many families that are suffering because of this pandemic. So we arrive at a challenge where, we have leaders like Mitch McConnell saying this is a blue state bailout. And what we have happening is at the same time is that there are other interests, other right-wing and corporate activity that are now using this as an excuse, attacking public employees, saying that we have to cut the fat from the public system in terms of so that we could balance our deficit. They are using this to their advantage. And so what we have to do now, 509, Local 509, as a union, it brings us to a point where we've never been before, where we have to do a few things, all geared towards one singular focus. And that singular focus is for funding to be provided to state governments, to municipal governments, because this is going to affect how we put, not just how we put food on the table for our loved ones, this is going to affect public services throughout the Commonwealth. And so this is where we're at. We have to make sure that we are sounding, we have the loudest voice, and that our voice is being heard to the Senate and to those who are responsible now for making sure that we don't have a choice, as Peter said earlier. Massachusetts cannot deficit spend, right? We can't declare, the state can't declare bankruptcy. So it's either the federal government help us out, or some tough decisions which have already started are going to continue to be made.
So what I want to do, the trends here, a couple questions that came up in the chat, are these trends nationwide or in Massachusetts? The answer is both. We expect privatization to be a real threat to our state workforce. We know there will be drastic changes coming to our state budget. There are conservative right-wing groups in Massachusetts who are very anti-worker, anti-union, who are putting out pieces about how to shrink the state workforce, how to stop public spending. And this isn't just about state workers, right? This is about all of our industries. We know that this is going to have a devastating impact. We don't have all the answers of how we're going to do this, but what we are trying to do is trying to get ahead of it by talking to policymakers about the economic impact of all of the industries where we represent members. Higher education is a key economic driver in Massachusetts. There are so many universities around Boston and throughout Massachusetts that drive the economy. We know that the work that our state workers do is so critical, and the increase in demand that we know is coming because of what is going on with the pandemic is real. So this isn't just about state workers. The initial ask of what Israel talked about with the HEROES Act is about replenishing, having the federal government replenish much of the lost revenue to Massachusetts so that it can focus on the services that it needs to provide and all of the industries in Massachusetts. So that's a lot of information. We are going to be making this PowerPoint available soon, later today or tomorrow, for folks to be able to see and walk through. We're also going to be doing these similar town halls with local chapters as well. We did that with the DCF chapter this morning. Mass Health is coming tomorrow, DDS is coming tomorrow, Higher Ed is next week. So those are being set up. But I know that I see a ton of things in the chat and Q&A, and I haven't been able to monitor them. So I'm gonna try to do my best to go through the Q&A and start to answer questions. But please, if you're on the call, please use that Q&A function or the chat function, and we'll try to walk through where things are at. But before, as I start to look at the questions so that Israel and I can start to answer them, we do have a couple more polls. So now we asked you, there you go. If we're faced, so the poll that just came up on there, if faced with budget negotiations where there will be a need for cost-cutting measures, what should we advocate for? And this is what we want to get a temperature check of what we think people should be doing. Should it be pay cuts? Should it be furloughs? Working more for the same pay, or no change to our pay or to work? So what do folks think about that? And while you're answering that, I'm going to start to look at the Q&A, and we can start to answer people's questions. So I do see a lot of state worker questions, that have come up, about furloughs, if that were to happen. So one question that somebody has is state workers, if we get furloughed, can we get unemployment due to the CARES Act? Yes, that would apply as well. And then also a question of furloughs, do we have to work with no pay or can we at least take time off this time? Furloughs are something that's negotiated, whether you work for the state, private agency, anywhere. Furloughs are negotiated with the union, so there are all kinds of different furloughs. And ultimately the members would have to vote on doing a furlough. So it's not just something that is imposed on you. So we're not there yet. If furloughs could be that you don't get paid and you don't work a particular day, I highly doubt that any of our employers would entertain that as an option for furloughs because the work that we do is so critical and the services that we provide, but that is possible. So why don't we take a look at the poll of what people would be willing to do. So it looks like it got cut off a little bit, but it looks like the majority of you, 51%, said you're not willing that we should do no changes to our pay or to our work if faced with difficult budget situations. 25% said furloughs, and 15% said working more for the same pay, and 9% said pay cuts. So about half of you said that we shouldn't look at any changes to our pay or to our work, given these budget situations. So I will say we are going to have to make some difficult decisions. It should be our priority to save as many jobs as we can. In full candor and full disclosure, I am anticipating layoffs. I am anticipating furloughs. I am anticipating budget cuts. The dire economic reality that we are facing, I don't think there's any way around that. And I think as a union, it is critically important that we do everything we can to save as many jobs as we can. Because even if you are feeling safe in your job, because you feel you have seniority and you're not worried that you may not get laid off, that your coworker losing their job is going to have an impact on you and your ability to do your job. It's going to cut into the economy. It's going to cut into the services that we provide. It is a critical time to really be thinking about what this means for Massachusetts and the members and the clients that we serve. So I'm going to have actually one of our communications team read us some of the questions because they've been keeping track of that for us. So Megan is going to join us.
Hi, everybody. So Peter Israel, the first question from members, can you talk about some of the tough decisions that we might be looking at in the next few months? What are some of the things we'd negotiate with the state?
Sure. It's a lot of what I was just talking about. As the state budget will shrink, best prediction by about $5 to $6 billion. Those cuts, that budget gap is going to have to be filled by something. And I think cuts to services and programs that are provided by state dollars are inevitable. So we're going to have to make some decisions about, and some fights about what those cuts may look like. It could be a reduction in workforce, depending, and this isn't just for state workers, since this could be really anywhere that you work. If the budgets are cut, a shrinking workforce, I think, is a real potential reality. The furloughs, working with our employers to to talk about, is there a way to have cost savings to avoid laying people off? Those are some of the decisions that we're going to have to make. And ultimately, some of these are going to have to be the membership deciding. And if the membership just voted against doing furloughs whatsoever, just as an example, I expect pretty big layoffs in all of our work sites. So it's pretty dire what the potential difficult decisions we're going to have to face are.
So a lot of folks, Peter, adding on to that, are asking when might we know when these layoffs are coming, and will the union get a heads up, and can we let folks know ahead of time?
We are doing this call to give you all a heads up as soon as we are reading the tea leaves and having these conversations. We don't want to wait to talk to our members about what potentially could be around the corner until it's upon us. So let me start with that. That's why we're having this call, and that's why I'm glad literally hundreds and hundreds of you have joined this call to hear some really difficult, information. But the short answer to when is we don't know. We expect that probably in the next month or so, the state legislature and the governor are going to start to cobble together what will be the budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And that will be the first chance that we will get to have a sense of where they are predicting to make budget cuts and service reductions. And that will start to inform our discussions. We are, though, now starting to talk to our employers, state, private, across the board, about what this may mean. And we're trying to get ahead of it. So we don't know the when. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And we are working hard to try to get ahead of it as quickly as we can. Because the other thing is, if we fight loud now, we could mitigate a number of cuts. So it has to be both offense and defense at the same time.
And this is why we have to work really hard to, when we talk about the next set of actions that we're going to do, this is why we have to do some targeted things to make sure we do something to mitigate these.
So I think, Israel, that's a great segue into a question from Natalie on here. What are some of the things we can do to make sure our voices are heard?
So I think it's very, very important that we are showing the essential services of the things that we do for the Commonwealth. And let's be clear, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts does not function without the roles and the jobs that are being performed by local 509 members. And this is why we need to be really loud right now. We will talk about, in a few minutes, we will talk about calling senators to make sure that these bills get passed. We have something called a 509 on the Frontline campaign, where many of you on social media have seen that the union has been trying to amplify the work that many of our members do, the essential work that we do. And as it was said earlier, if we don't have these essential services, well, then guess what? You have no economy. Our family childcare providers, if you don't have childcare, how could people go out there and be expected to be productive and bring back this economy? So I think it is very important that we continue to educate the public as to the importance of what we do and how essential our roles are in making sure that the Massachusetts economy gets up and running and revving once again. And we will be reaching out to all of you as to different steps and the different things that we will need help with. If it's just Peter and I that are saying state workers are essential, private sector workers are essential, family childcare, higher ed workers are essential, higher ed faculty, then we wouldn't need a labor movement, right? But the strength will really come from all of us, really amplifying that.
So another question coming in that a few folks have asked, will furloughs be done before layoffs?
That would be the intent of furloughs if there are employers, and remember, furloughs are negotiated, so the employers have to be willing to engage in that too. But yes, the purpose of furloughs is to see what cost savings can be found to avoid actually laying people off. So the short answer to that is yes, but we have to have employers who are willing to work with us on that.
Sure. And another couple folks asking the same question here, so I'm condensing. Have any state agencies mentioned layoffs yet?
Not at this point, no. The state has been hyper-focused, as it should be, on the fires that were in front of us. of changing the way that work needs to happen. But we have also seen the state spending incredible amounts of money. But that said, that's only really all that we've heard where states have not talked about cutting workforces. Massachusetts is the only state that has not started to publicly talk about laying workers off. Every other state that I'm aware of, and certainly every state where SEIU represents people, that those discussions have started. And that includes in Rhode Island and in New Hampshire and in Connecticut and in New York. It's coming.
And could you talk a little bit about what Congress is doing? What can we be doing to support the legislation that just went through in Congress? A few questions about that.
Yeah, so first of all, I want everyone to like us on Facebook, because if you like us on Facebook, you will have seen one of the actions that we need you to do. And we're going to put this out in emails and elsewhere as well. But we need you to call your senators. And if you live in Massachusetts, that's Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey. And we need the Senate to move the HEROES Act and move it forward. So the immediate ask is we need to call our senators in Washington and demand that the HEROES Act get passed. Now, Massachusetts senators are going to be pretty much on board with that, but they still need to hear from you so they can use the stories that you tell them to go and convince their colleagues in other states that the HEROES Act needs to be passed. So that is number one. The number and the script are on our Facebook page. We'll be sending that out in other forms as well.
And Peter, just a clarification for folks, can you explain the difference between furloughs and layoffs? It's come through a few times.
Sure, yeah. Furloughs, well, let me start. Layoffs would mean you lose your job and you no longer have a job and you no longer have income from that job. A furlough would be that you have some type of pay cut, but you remain employed and remain in that job. So it's a loss of pay, but you keep your job. And furloughs could be that you just lose pay, but you work still your same shift, but your pay is reduced for X number, the equivalent of, say, 5 days worth of pay. Or it could be that you lose 5 days worth of pay and you don't work. So those are kind of different types of furloughs. But a furlough means you remain employed, but you lose income. A layoff means you lose your job.
Great. And Peter, our higher ed members are sending a few questions in, and they would just love to know, can you forecast anything right now? What's going on in the next few months? What is the union hearing?
Yeah, it's kind of all over the place with higher ed across the country. Even in Massachusetts, I should say, some smaller universities have started to fold. Boston College, I know, took over one university that's down south of Boston. I forget, it's a smaller campus there. BC announced today that they plan to reopen in the fall, and Northeastern has planned that. BU is talking maybe in 2021. We really don't know. I'm actually going to be getting on a call on Thursday with SEIU leaders from different locals that have higher ed across the United States to kind of start to get a sense of that. And there's going to be some research and some data that we'll be diving into on that call that I will then be sharing with the higher ed chapter and membership here. So higher ed's a little bit further down the line with what the economic impact is going to be, but even some of our campuses here in Massachusetts are predicting drops of enrollment of 20 to 30%, and that's really, really scary as well. But we should know more in the coming, literally in the next couple of days, of what we think may be the impact for higher ed.
Okay, thank you. And a lot of folks asking, would early retirement potentially be on the table, or buyouts?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's pretty much unique for state workers. Maybe we haven't heard any conversation about that yet. But part of the problem with an early retirement, that may save some people from being laid off, But usually what happens is if someone gets an early retirement package, they don't backfill the position. So you still lose staff, and that it impacts, so it's still a loss of a job. And it may save some money, but you still have a reduction in the workforce. It just means that maybe it saves someone from actually being laid off, which is a good thing. But it also does, it's not free. So even as someone retires for the state, they go on into the state, through the pension system, and there are some costs associated with that. So early retirement may be an option. We haven't heard anything yet, but the legislature's been painfully quiet on what is going to be coming in the coming weeks, but I expect that'll certainly be part of the conversation.
And Peter, another question from Mike in the chat. What guarantee would more funding do? What would funding from the federal government do?
So the National Governors Association, so the 50 governors of the United States, all came together and said, we need $500 billion to close the budget shortfalls that we know are coming because of COVID. And that will allow us, this is what they've said, that will allow us to not cut funding to services and cut jobs. So the first thing is that money that is being lost needs to be replenished. And yes, in theory, a governor could take that and not spend it on jobs and spend it on some other part of that. But that's where at the local level, we would push and fight to make sure that, assuming we're able to get that money, and for Massachusetts, it's like $5 to $6 billion, that $5 to $6 billion goes first and foremost to jobs for both the state workforce, but also for the jobs that are funded by the state budget.
And so basically what we're saying is that in 2008, when we know that Congress bailed out the big companies, you all remember that when that happened? So all we're saying is now the states need that. States need that bailout in order to protect public services. And so that's why we're advocating for that.
Another question from folks about layoffs, and maybe you could speak from the previous time there were layoffs, Peter. What is the process? Who would get laid off first? Do we even know?
Yeah, so the layoff rules are spelled out in every contract. Most of the contracts are very similar for what the rules are of layoffs. There may be some slight variation depending on the agency that you work for. For the state, there's one set of rules because it's in the state contract, but then each of the private sector agencies, those contracts have different provisions for layoffs. But in general, layoffs are done by job title. So they're going to say, for example, we need to eliminate, I'm going to make up a number here. We need to eliminate 100 jobs in job title X. And so if there's 400 people now in that, they need to lay off 100 of those individuals. The way that the layoffs happen is by inverse seniority. So the last hired, the first fired, to put it crudely. There are some variations and some nuances to that where it may be a little bit different everywhere, but that kind of depends on the contract. But that is a very general structure of how a layoff process would work.
Great. And another state worker question from Leah. Could you talk a little bit about privatization? That's been looming over us for a while. What would that look like?
Yeah, I'm actually, for the state workforce, I'm pretty worried about privatization, and that depends on which agency you work at. I think some of our state agencies are more susceptible to threats of privatization than others. Mass Health, DTA, DOR, DDS, DMH. I am particularly worried about threats of privatization there. There will be an allure to have the state save money by privatizing services, and it's sold as is, hey, we can do the same work that state workers do, but we can do it for less. And that may be true, but it's because they pay their workers so little. So the costs of doing that is, and ask any of our private sector members what they get paid. They do the same work that state workers do, but they get paid sometimes, less than half of what state workers get, sometimes worse than that. So there will be attempts. I am very worried about of attempts at privatization of some of our state work. What it would mean for state workers if privatization happened, you would lose your job, and it would go to a private vendor. We've seen privatization happen just recently at DMH in the last couple of years in the Southeast with the emergency psychiatric services. So we went through that, and people lost their jobs, and it got contracted out. So it's a really scary thing that we really need to push back hard against, because the savings are short term, and if you're not paying people, you're not getting a good, it just doesn't actually help.
And Peter and Israel, we are getting a lot of questions about what can I do? What can we be doing? And I wonder if that would be a great segue into our next poll.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. And we know there will be lots of questions. We're coming up to the hour. We still have several hundred people on the call, which is great. And we will be doing a version of this with each of your chapters where you will be able to ask a lot more questions, and we will be out talking a lot more about this. This is not a one-time conversation. We know that there will be many, many, many more questions that come up. But to that, we want to ask you, what are you willing to do? So those who are on their computers and laptops can see the question that's come up. How can you help us fight back against these budget cuts? And this, select as many as you're willing to do. This is one of those where you can select more than one. But are you willing to call or email your legislators? Are you willing to talk to the press about your story and the work that you do? Are you willing to be featured in the 509 on the Front Lines campaign? Are you willing to help organize your coworkers to call or email their legislators? Or are you too busy right now? Do you have too much going on and you can't do any of those things? Well, I think in the chat says you can only select one. I think we had intended to make it more than one. So pick the one that you would do the most. You'd be most likely to do. Sorry about that. Sorry for that confusion. But what would you be willing to do? And you may be willing to do a lot of those, and hopefully you're willing to do all of them. But why don't you take a minute to do that? And then as we wrap up the call, we'll talk about this. We talked about this through the call. We need to call the Senate. That's first and foremost of what we need to do. But we also need to put out there, so here we go. So this would be the first thing that you would be willing to do. And 59% of you said you're willing to call or email your legislators. And I see in the chat, a lot of folks are saying they're willing to do more than just one. So that's great. That's really good. 7% said you're willing to talk to the press about your story. And I get that. That can be really scary, talking to the press, especially if you haven't done it. 3% are willing to be featured in the 509 on the Front Lines. 29% said you're willing to help your coworkers call their legislators. So that's really great. I'd like seeing that. And really great, only 2% of you said you're too busy right now. So that's great, because we're going to need people to do all of those things. And the 509 the Front Lines campaign that we're doing, if you're on social media, if you're on our Facebook page, you can see that. We need to show the public that the work you all do is critical, and we can't afford to cut it. That it needs to be, it is frontline work. It is essential work. And the way we can start doing that are telling your stories. We all know it. Everyone on this call knows it. We get it. But we're not the ones who need convincing. So that's really important that we get those stories out there. Your stories are powerful, really powerful.
Yeah, and I'm so heartened to see 29%, well, so many people, and I'm sure more of you would have said that you're willing to talk to a co-worker as well. But, 509 represents 20,000 people, and we have quite a few hundred people on this call. So if every one of you could talk to 10 of your co-workers, how powerful that will be, especially for what we're trying to do right now. And so that was really, that's very good to see. Because sometimes, we do get inundated with the emails and the calls and all kinds of things coming at us. And I think it's very powerful for those of you on this call to talk one-on-one with your coworkers. I think that is going to be a powerful tool for us.
And I can't stress enough, this is a moment in time where this is critical. If we don't take action now, you know, the hits could be devastating. And we need to be out there talking about the work that we do in those stories. So there will be other things as well, but the immediate, I saw in the chat, a couple of people had asked, where's the script to call the senator, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll put that out in an email. We'll get that out in as many forms as we can. We'll be talking to you about that. So you will have a script and some talking points for that. But there's still a lot of folks who are still on. We're at the end of the hour, but Israel and I are willing to stay on and answer some more questions for folks. So since there are a lot, so Megan, if you have other questions that have come up.
So folks are wondering if there's been any indication from the state if members will be allowed to work remotely for longer. How much longer?
Yeah, I think with the state workforce, those who are teleworking, I think you should expect to telework for the foreseeable future, and that's probably could be through the end of the year, if not longer. So the state's intent is anyone who is teleworking will continue to telework. Even if you need to go into the offices, it's going to be in more staggered shifts. You're not going to be able to go into an office and have 100 people in there. You're just not. So the work is going to have to be done remotely. So if you are teleworking, I would expect that will continue for quite some time.
Got it. And another question, a few folks' questions. They've noticed that agencies are still hiring. Can we explain kind of that difference?
Yeah, I really don't know. This came up on our DCF call earlier today, and Adriana Zwick, who's the chapter president there, was going to follow up. I don't know. I think it's really short-sighted for the Commonwealth or for any of our agencies to be hiring right now. Some of it may have been that there were hires in the pipeline that were already kind of almost ready to come on board. Some of it probably is honestly, this happened over a 6-week period, you know, so everyone was heads were just spinning. So my sense is it's probably a combination of those things, but we are asking that question too, and we really don't know.
Yeah.
Another
We're still
question
getting answers too.
Another question from a member who's asked this a few times now. Does working from home save any money from the state?
In the short term, no. Unless your state agency already had the mobile technology, and most did not. Some still do not. They've had to have a significant investment in laptops or iPads or cell phones or whatnot. They're still paying the same rent on office space as they were 6 weeks ago. So the short term is no. And in fact, short term, it's probably cost more money. But I do think in the long term, there are going to be opportunities for cost savings with telework. There's going to have to be an initial investment in the technology if your agency hasn't done that. But I think long-term, we can find some savings there in reduced rent and office space and whatnot.
Great. And Peter, I see a lot of our higher ed members in the chat, and I think their question is, what is the forecast for working from home in the fall in particular? Would they be able to continue teaching remotely and not have to move to in-class teaching?
Yeah, that's a lot of that's going to probably depend on the universities themselves and what they're willing to do. Some universities like BU, I think, is thinking more remotely, you know, that's going to continue maybe through the fall semester. Others like Northeastern, and I saw BC, even though we don't represent BC, but they chimed in today. They want people back on campuses in the fall. So it's a little hard to predict what that is because the fall feels so far away, even though we know it's not. And we really need to figure out, we really need to let the public health experts drive this. Is it safe to come back to campuses right now? My sense is probably not, and maybe not even in the fall. And that may be our best push, because I know a lot of our members want to be able to continue to teach remotely. But it's a little fuzzy for higher ed. And that's frustrating for me, and I know for our higher ed members to not know what that future is, but it's it is a little fuzzy right now, but I think that it's starting to come together as universities are starting to put their plans for the fall together.
Great. And Peter, a family child care member had asked a question earlier in the chat. What are we thinking is going to happen in the next month or so?
Yeah, so childcare is critically important to reopening the economy, as we all know. And we have been engaged in regular conversations with EEC about what childcare is going to look like. I expect that we're going to start to see those recommendations start to come together. I did have a conversation with the commissioner yesterday about this, and she is very committed to letting the science and the medical information and the public health information drive what childcare looks like. But we don't know that, you know, because there's, as even she said, there's never been COVID-19 before, so we don't know what this means for kids and all that. I do expect that childcare will look very different. I don't think you're going to be able to have as many kids in your program as before. You know, so I think that's going to change. So we're really pushing to make sure that no one loses any income, even if you know, the number of kids in your program has to be reduced. But I expect a little more in the next couple of weeks on that. There are very active conversations happening about what childcare is going to look like.
Great, thank you. And I think, you know, a lot of folks have very specific questions about their sector and their agency. And I know we're past the 6 o'clock mark. Could we just lay out next steps for the different chapters in terms of these town halls? Just so folks know that their questions can be answered going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Today, actually, we submitted a set of policy recommendations to, it was either today or yesterday, but we submitted a set of policy recommendations to all of our private sector employers to say, these are the expectations we have for work going forward. And we're going to get those out to folks, should be tomorrow, so people can see, or Friday. We did it on Friday as a friendly reminder, came up in my chat. But anyway, we sent those out to those employers, and we're going to get that out to you all to see what we are saying are driving it. We've already done that for childcare, and we sent that out to our members. We've done that with the state workforce. We've sent that out. We're working on that on higher ed. So each agency and each sector and each employer is going to look a little different for what the recommendations are. So what we are doing with these town halls, as I said earlier and through the call, we're going to be doing, Israel and I are going to be doing with the chapter presidents a very similar town hall that will be more chapter specific, where we will be able to answer more specific what it means if you work at DDS, and what it means if you work for Elliott Human Services, and what it means if you're a family child care provider. So we know those are coming, and our staff and our chapter presidents and the elected leaders are also going to be out talking to you guys, and they're always available for that. So there'll be many opportunities for you to ask your agency and employer and sector specific questions in the coming, literally in the next few days. This is all coming together and over the next week or so.
Great. So I think a lot of the questions that we have are really specific to folks, their agencies. So we'll be sending out an email tomorrow with the recording of this town hall and resources for you to ask the questions that you need to ask.
Yeah, we just want to thank you all for everything you do for the Commonwealth, and you know, hope that you and your family, loved ones, are staying safe. And you know, we're going to do the best that we can, all of us together. I think, you know, we have a mission, and you know, just wishing everyone the best.
Yes, thank you all for all that you do, and so proud. Israel and I are so proud to lead this local and just be shoulder to shoulder with you in this fight. So we know we can do it because we're 509, and that's what we do. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy your night, and stay safe and healthy.